Hello, and thank you for joining the National Disaster Housing Recovery Coalition call. We are just going to give folks a minute or two to log on, and then we can get started. So just hold on for a moment. Hi, everybody. Thank you for joining the Disaster Housing Recovery Coalition's national call. As a reminder, we are a coalition of 890 national, state, and local organizations, including many working directly in disaster impacted areas and with firsthand experience recovering from disasters. Our coalition works together to ensure that federal disaster housing recovery efforts reach all impacted households, including those with the lowest incomes and those who are the most marginalized. As we know from our work, these are the households that are hardest hit by disasters, who also have the fewest resources to recover and face the longest and steepest paths to recovery. On today's call, we're going to hear updates from Puerto Rico and Florida in their recovery process from Hurricanes Fiona and Ian. We're also really excited to have folks join on from HUD who can share more information about their recent announcement to create the Rapid Unsheltered Survivor Housing Program, the RUSH program. As I mentioned on our last call, this announcement is a major victory for housing advocates nationwide. For many years, we all collectively had been pushing for resources to help people experiencing homelessness or at risk of homelessness following a disaster. And we're really excited to see HUD take the lead in stepping in to serve this role, especially while FEMA resources and FEMA refuses to make the changes that are needed to activate their programs that would serve that need too. So we're going to hear much more about what is to come with that program and use our collective voice to thank the folks at HUD who have joined with us today, who can share more details. And at the end, we're going to hear about a legislative opportunity to authorize the Community Development Block Grant Disaster Recovery Program. This is HUD's long-term disaster recovery program, which currently is not formally authorized. And so it's major legislation that we hope could move by the end of the year. So we'll have more details on that and the ways that people can get involved. Just as a heads up, we have these calls every Tuesday at 2 o'clock. So if you're interested in joining future calls, please keep that in mind. We are not going to be meeting next week because that is election day and we have the day off. So this is your nonpartisan reminder to get out and vote. We also have various working groups that you can participate in. We have a disaster working group that meets on Wednesdays that gets more into the weeds on disaster reforms that are needed. We also have a Puerto Rico working group, which is really led by people on the island, but we help facilitate. So if you are in Puerto Rico and you want to be involved, please let us know and we can help connect you. So we're going to get along with our agenda and we're going to start with Puerto Rico and we're going to hear from Mary Ture from Hispanic Federation, one of the partners that we've been working really closely with over the last several years. So I'm going to turn it over to you.
Thank you very much, Sarah, and thank you to the National Low Income Housing Coalition for this opportunity. I just want to go straight to use my time to mention the main ask that Hispanic Federation has to FEMA and HUD regarding what is happening in Puerto Rico after Hurricane Fiona. The major disaster declaration of Fiona was published on September 25th 1st. So the deadline to apply for the individual assistance program is now in November, around the November 21st. But the issue that we are having is that declaration had like around 7 to 8 amendments afterwards to include the 78 municipalities that are within Puerto Rico's jurisdiction. And now what you have is that different groups of municipality have different deadlines to apply for the individual assistance. And this creates a lot of confusion. And what we are asking FEMA is to extend all the deadlines to the latest one so that there's no confusion for survivors on how much time they have to apply for assistance. Second, we are having a lot of people, survivors are not familiarized with the FEMA application, do not understand all the sections. FEMA do not have a step-by-step, video in Spanish that can help people to understand the application all the way. So people can easily, after an emergency and a disaster with a post-disaster stress, can make a lot of mistakes while applying for the aid online, for example. So we need FEMA to create an alternative to amend the application so that survivors can, correct the mistakes that they have made without having to go through a whole process of appeal, which is really expensive or requires more time or resources. Another ask is that here in Puerto Rico, a lot of time we are working and power goes out, the internet goes down, and there have been cases where people are applying for assistance and the internet goes out, and then when they log in again to try to complete the application, then it says that it's a duplicate. So we need somehow for the system to allow survivors to save the application so that they can log in and correct mistakes and complete the process. Call centers. We are facing a real big need of Spanish-speaking or interpreters in the call center services. At the beginning, the waiting time for Spanish services was more than 350 minutes. Now, when you call, even though you ask for Spanish translation, they say we are having issues getting Spanish interpreters. And then even though you ask for Spanish, sometimes English speaking employees answers the phone, and there have been cases when the people ask for Spanish service and they hang up. So that cannot happen. This FEMA knows that in Puerto Rico you need to have a lot of Spanish speaking employees in these centers. The DRC, the disaster recovery centers, there are only 33 centers for 78 municipalities. We think as much as possible to open more and more so that more municipalities can have access to the centers. And something that is happening that we are seeing is that when you go there, the people that understand English get faster service because they have more English-speaking employees. And once again, only a few Spanish-speaking employees with no interpreters sometimes. So they have longer waiting time for the survivors that only understand or speak Spanish. And also they don't have permanent sign language interpreters in the centers. So deaf people, for example, need to make send an email requesting an appointment. And we know of cases where even though they requested and made the appointment, the interpreter never got to the center. And the excuse or the explanation is that they have issues hiring interpreters. But this is something that was foreseeable, that FEMA knew that in Puerto Rico, these services needs to be in Spanish. Also, we need a Spanish and sign language translation, not only to apply, but through the whole process. We know about 2 cases that of deaf people that the FEMA inspectors went to their home and they didn't know sign language. And they completed the inspection without the survivors understanding what was happening. This is a violation of due process for the survivors. Survivors should know what is happening along all the process of application, that means inspection and determination of the case. So once again, the need of Spanish speaking and sign language services. The FEMA employees are not advising correctly the people that they have the option to present alternative documentation and a declarative statement to prove ownership when they don't have a deed or a title, a formal title of the property. This is something that happened with Maria. A lot of people were denied the aid because they didn't have formal title. FEMA already amended the guideline to allow for the declarative statement as an option if you don't have a formal deed of your property, but still they are not advising the survivors that that's an option. And FEMA, instead of requiring formal documentation, should be providing that advice. We already know from an organization in Loíza, Taller Salud, that they are receiving a lot of calls that the aid has been denied because of ownership issues, once again. Another big issue here in Puerto Rico is the addresses. No aid should be denied because FEMA do not understand Puerto Rico's addresses. For example, in Loíza, you have a whole community that share the same address. All the houses in that community has the same address. And what happens is that when they apply, they get denied because of the duplicate of the address, right? And this is something that is going to happen a lot in a lot of vulnerable communities around the island. And FEMA knows this and should not make these people go through the appeal process. There's a specific case, for example, of a 2-floor house where the first floor got the assistance and the second floor that has share the same address, but lost the roof, couldn't access the aid. And now, of course, they need to do the appeal process, but only because FEMA is not addressing the reality of the addresses system in Puerto Rico. Finally, I do want to mention a few asks directly to HUD. First, we need to prioritize blue tarps. We have a lot of people that have been waiting under the CDBG-DR programs for assistance that are living since Maria and the earthquake on the blue tarps and that face Fiona without a safe roof. This needs to be a priority. This is causing displacement because of exhaustion. People are tired of waiting. And with Fiona, it's just like too much. They lost everything they have again. And we need the Puerto Rico Housing Department and HUD to be prioritizing and acting quickly. Right now, there was a substantial amendment to the action plan where they are proposing a study to identify where are the blue tarps in the island, when there have been doing studies through the last 5 years trying, they had enough time during the past 5 years to identify the blue tarps. So now what we need is action, concrete action to address those houses and provide a safe home to these people. Another important ask is to waive the reimbursement and matching funds, and this goes to FEMA programs. In Puerto Rico, the nonprofit organizations, community organizations, and municipalities do not have the money to spend in infrastructure projects and then ask for reimbursement. Recently, I was listening to the mayor of Yabucoa that we had flooding events last week and a main bridge collapsed. And he was explaining that even though they have FEMA money approved, they cannot implement the projects because the municipality doesn't have the money to put up front and then ask for reimbursement. This is a reality in Puerto Rico. Puerto Rico is in bankruptcy. So if you want the aid to get to the people, you need to waive those requirements, reimbursement and matching funds. And I do want to say that we have been fighting for the Citizen Advisory Committee to be established under the CDBG-DR programs and CDBG mitigation program. This committee has not been structured yet, and it has to be structured and creative for public accountability on what is happening with the aid and the funding. If you truly want the effective use of these federal funds, you need to establish the Citizen Advisory Committee as a public forum for transparency, public participation, and accountability. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Marie-Tere. I just want to ask you a couple of questions, if that's okay. And
yes.
Just a reminder to folks on the line, if you have a question for our speakers, you can enter them into the Q&A box. We'll try to get to as many of them as we can. One question that we got was whether or not you need translation. It sounded like sign language interpretation and Spanish interpretation. Are there other languages in Puerto Rico that also need translation services?
Well, most of the population speaks Spanish. Of course, this applies to everybody that speaks any language, but mainly it's Spanish and sign language, the need.
Okay, wonderful. And where can people go if they want to find out more information about the self-declaration forms? Where can they go to get one if they're trying to apply or if they want to share it with other people on the island who are applying?
The individual assistant guideline, which has more than 300 pages, in chapter 3, they have the specific language of the declarative statement that the FEMA employers should be providing that format to the survivors. There's the only place I have seen the language. I know that recently in Facebook, I think FEMA posted something about the declarative statement, but that's the main source. And another thing, the individual assistance program guideline, the 1.1 version, we only find it in English. When you go to FEMA website, it only is available in English. If you find it in Spanish, let me know, because we have been trying to find it. And that's another ask that we have. I didn't mention it, but it's an important one.
Yeah, and I know that these translation issues aren't new to FEMA. Can you talk a little bit about when Hurricane Maria occurred, there were problems getting applications in Spanish, so many of the same problems that you're mentioning today. Can you talk a little bit about what, if anything, has improved in Spanish, providing Spanish translations, or is it still very much a consistent problem?
I know now the translation is in Spanish, and I think the format, the digital format, is a little bit more friendly, but the problem is that they're assuming that everybody in Puerto Rico has broadband access, that everybody can go online. And I went through the application step by step, and it's not that easy to understand. You can easily make mistakes. So for people that are in a post-disaster stress mental situation, that doesn't have broadband access, that don't have energy, power in their cell phones to be like a long time, filling up the application. That's why we focus a lot also in direct assistance door to door to homes through the whole process. There's a lot of people, elderly, disabled people in really poor communities with no internet access, no cell phone, and cannot walk to the DRC centers, which are not in every municipality. So I do have to say that the format, I think, is more friendly, but still there's a lot of hurdle of completing the application and understanding the process.
Yeah, I appreciate that. There's a lot of lessons learned from the Treasury Emergency Rental Assistance Program, where many communities used navigators or community-based organizations to help people in applying. It would be great to see something similar happening with FEMA. I really appreciate you joining on today's call. If you're able to stay on, I know that there are a few more questions in the chat box and the Q&A box. If you're able to answer them, that's wonderful. And I really appreciate you taking the time to join with us. Wonderful. So now we'll move to Florida, where we will hear from Lewis Healy, who's the CEO of Affordable Homeownership Foundation, Inc. And I will turn it over to Lois.
Okay, good afternoon, everybody, and thank you for having me on. It's been challenging the past few weeks trying to get everything together. We have spent the last 2 weeks at the shelter, which now houses 576 people. We did a survey for the first few days, and most of the people that we talked to are very low income or extremely low income. And unfortunately, we did survey of the housing stock right before we started at the shelter. And out of 9,300 and some odd units, we have 100 units that were available 2 weeks ago on Friday, with the lowest price units for a 1-bedroom going at $1,400. These are apartments. Single family homes, the majority of the stock was demolished or is in pretty bad shape. So we don't have a count on that right now, but most of those people are staying at the shelter as well. We're trying to find people jobs that have lost their jobs. We have Future Maker Coalition with us. We've also had Florida Rural Legal Services there to explain about the lease situation, that if you have an active lease and you're not in your dwelling and it was destroyed or you can't live there, you're still responsible for your rental payment unless you send a letter to your landlord explaining that you can't live there anymore and you want to get out of your lease. Most of the clients that we talked to didn't understand that. They thought that if they just didn't pay their rent, that they were okay with that, and that's not the case, which I was surprised about. If we hadn't been doing a responsible renters class with Florida Rural Legal Services, I never would have found that out myself. The debris cleanup's going well. They have repaired the bridge to Sanibel Island. It's only a temporary fix. They're now allowing people on Fort Myers Beach that live there and on Sanibel to try to go assess the damages at their home and meet with FEMA and insurance adjusters and contractors. That's a really slow process because now Fort Myers Beach is going through some growing pains and they want to fire their whole town council and start over because they don't think they're doing a good job. We still have thousands of boats on top of thousands of boats on Fort Myers Beach and in the Fort Myers River District, which they're going to have to bring in heavy machinery to get those off of each other and back in the water or somewhere to be repaired or destroyed. And they're also clogging up the waterways with, there's cars in the water. There's also all sorts of debris that's blocking the canals and the beaches. So it needs to be cleaned up so it doesn't pollute the water any further. The poorest of the poor are the ones that are really having a hard time. They're thinking of getting vouchers to move them out of state temporarily until they can find permanent housing, but with the housing stock starting at $1,400 and the average person on Social Security disability making between $841 and $1,000, most of those people will not be housed in Lee County anytime soon. That's basically all I have from this end.
Hi, Lois. Thanks for sharing that. I'm wondering if you could tell a little bit about, I think you mentioned 500 plus people are in your shelter in your area. What's the plan for moving those households into housing if they're, obviously you said the housing stock is too expensive. There may be some resources for vouchers. Will that serve all of those households, or what else is needed to make sure that people have stable housing going forward?
Well, the very low income, if they're disabled, we're looking at mainstream vouchers, but again, the voucher problem is getting the landlords to accept the voucher. So we're working on that with some legislation through the county. For the people that have income, our housing navigators working with the Future Maker Coalition's navigator to try to get those people housed. And now FHA just came out with a 203H loan, which allows people to purchase a house at 100%. They still have to pay closing costs and prepaids. So anyone that has damage to their house, if they want to fix up their house, they can use that loan. Or if they want to purchase a house, they can do that. The problem is going out and inspecting the housing stock that is available, that was for sale. And then the other biggest hurdle is the interest rates, now being at 7+%. So most of the people that are making 35 to 50,000, the average house price here starts at 350. You can do the math with a 7% interest rate. They're not going to be able to afford it. I used to be an affordable lender, so the math doesn't work. But they do have a plan. They've been exiting a few. I think they exited. As they exit people, more people that were on the beach and places that were destroyed are moving back into the shelter. So we could lose 76 one day and get 76 the next day. So it's been a constant battle of trying to get that into a normal number so that we can work off that number and move forward. So we are trying different things to try to get people housed, being creative with Red Cross and with FEMA. So.
And are you able to share any update on the impact on residents of manufactured housing?
Well, the manufacturing housing in this area, most of it was destroyed. The areas that weren't destroyed were pretty much damaged. We do have a couple of communities that had a couple manufactured homes still there, but there was one community that got hit twice, once with a tornado back in June or July, and then again with the hurricane. So they've all decided they're going to move elsewhere because their houses were destroyed a second time. I've been talking to some of the people that do tilt-up construction and also the other type of construction that you can bring on site and assemble. But again, we've got to go through the permitting process, which is taking longer than normal. We have to get things condemned and destroyed. Understand, we were still dealing with Rebuild Florida from Irma. So most of those places had not been fixed yet or replaced. So I'm not sure where we would be at with the situation at this point, trying to move into Ian with Irma people still not being handled. So I guess Rebuild Florida was taken over by DEO. And I would call them every month. They had 5 or 6 clients that still had houses that were destroyed that they were waiting on replacements from. And they were claiming it was because of shortages in the market and housing stock, building materials, those type of things that were causing issues. So, like I said, it's going to be a really long recovery trying to get those things addressed quickly.
Yeah, and we'll have, as I mentioned earlier, folks from HUD who will speak to their new RUSH program, which may be helpful to you in serving some of the households that you're talking about. There's a lot of questions about RUSH in the Q&A, and we will get to that when we have our HUD folks on. So, but keep the questions coming. I did want to ask you another question about the Transitional Shelter Assistance Program, the Hotel Motel Program. How's that going? Are there access issues there too that we should be aware of?
Yeah, there's major access issues. Most of the TSA housing, transitional housing assistance is in Tampa, Kissimmee, Orlando, and Georgia. So we don't have any local housing or any local hotels that are participating right now. They're still in negotiation to try to get that. But anybody that has a job can't go to Orlando or Northern Tampa and try to drive that every day and keep their job. So that's been a major issue. And then Georgia's just way off the map. So they're either going to have to relocate or stick it out in a shelter or their damaged properties, which is insane. So.
Absolutely. And I'm just going to see if there are other questions here. Let's see. I think that's all of the questions that we have for you right now. I really appreciate you joining on. There are some questions, so if you're able to stick on and answer those questions in the Q&A box or in the chat box, feel free to do that. Okay. And we appreciate you joining.
All right, thank you.
Okay, next we are going to hear from Joe Carlisle and Marion McFadden with HUD to talk about their new RUSH program. Before we bring them on, I do want to say, I just want to repeat myself that, this is a major victory, I think, for housing advocates and disaster advocates. A lot of this work is because of the work Joe Carlisle did while he was at HUD, but before he was at HUD, when he was working on the appropriations committee for Chairman Price, he really was doing a lot of the heavy lifting behind the scenes to make sure that resources were available for people experiencing homelessness and at risk of homelessness. So I want to be especially, we're just so grateful to him and using his platform to really lift up the needs of people who are often overlooked in the disaster recovery process. So with that, I'm going to ask Joe if he can join on. I know Marion is planning on joining any minute now. But maybe we could start with Joe.
Thank you for that warm welcome and great introduction, Sarah. It made me smile a little bit. So, hey, I'll kind of take the overview real quick here and maybe lay the groundwork for the backstory. And then Marion can talk about all the exciting work that she at CPD has done to get this program out into the world. But as Sarah talked about, Section 231 of the fiscal year 2020 Appropriations Act did a couple of things. But when there would be homeless assistance grants funds that would go back to the Treasury after recaptures at the end, it would allow the department to keep those monies and then do certain things with them. One of the certain things is they have to use not less than 10% for folks affected by a natural disaster who were experiencing homelessness or at risk of homelessness prior to the disaster. 10% has to go for that. That's what we're going to talk about today. That is the RUSH program. Want to also talk about another thing, just briefly, that those Section 231 monies were used for. As you may know, the department had a unsheltered NOFO of $300 million that it did earlier. The funds for that unsheltered NOFO were also funded via the authority in Section 231. Really excited about the fact that the department took the opportunities outlined in Section 231 and has put them both out into the world this year. But RUSH is what we're calling this new money. Stands for Rapid Unsheltered Survivor Housing, which we really want to convey the speed at which we're trying to move. It's one of the few places where HUD has funds available for disaster spending before disaster. We looked to TSA's Transitional Sheltering Assistance Program as the trigger, which was mentioned in the enabling statute in Section 231. We're really excited that we were able to make awards to the folks in Florida who needed it so quickly after the disaster, because that's rare for the department. Typically, we have to wait for the Congress to go do a supplemental appropriation to give us the resources we need. We wouldn't be here without the hard work of Principal Deputy Assistant Secretary Marion McFadden and the folks in the Special Needs Office over in CPD. So I'd like to turn it over to her now to be able to talk about all the work that she and her folks have done and bringing this exciting new tool to bear to people who really could need it. Marion?
Thanks, Joe. Hi, everyone. Really, really, really happy to be here. If there is such a thing as a founding member of the DHRC, I count myself among them. In my last job, I got to work closely with you all, and I bring the knowledge of so much I learned from so many of you into the job that I have now at HUD, which includes supervising the disaster CDBG DR program, the homeless programs, the CDBG home and housing trust fund programs, as well as some little guys. So really happy to be here and appreciate all that you are doing to talk about the policy reforms that are needed. Hope to have many, many conversations with NLIHC about many things over the time to come, because I just so deeply respect the work you're doing. I apologize if there's background noise. I'm in a private place, but with open windows and a busy street. So thank you for the introduction, Joe. If anyone doesn't know, Joe really was the father of this RUSH baby. When he was in the Appropriations Committee, he saw the need to meet this gap. And so we truly wouldn't be here without Joe. I just was lucky enough to be here in time to say, okay, let's get this going. So that next time we have a TSA designation by FEMA, we can put it into place. And unfortunately, we had that opportunity with Hurricane Ian in Florida. So next slide, please. So as Joe mentioned, what we're trying to do is fill the gap in federal disaster assistance for people who before the disaster were experiencing homelessness or at risk of homelessness. As you know, or as you have heard from others, people who are experiencing homelessness before disaster have a really hard time accessing resources, either because they're statutorily precluded because they don't have the level of physical damage needed, or because they're discouraged locally from applying things that they do qualify for. So we said, all right, how do we make these funds available? Let's look first to the most major disasters because we can't fund all of them. So we look to when FEMA activates TSA, because that tells us that the disaster was so severe that it's created significant displacement due to the damage of housing, and that we need temporary housing solutions. Although our funds are reaching beyond just temporary. So because people who are experiencing homelessness wouldn't have access to TSA, we said, okay, this is the right moment to come in. I will say this is the first one we're rolling out. You will have the opportunity to comment on the way we are going to run the program going forward. That will be coming as well. So interested in hearing what folks have to say today, but there will also be a formal chance to advise the department on how to administer these funds. Next slide, please. So these funds are part and parcel of the Emergency Solutions Grant Program. So like the Emergency Solutions Grant Program, the funds are available to states and units of general local government. So again, it's for people who before the disaster were experiencing homelessness, living in an emergency shelter, transitional housing, or other place not meant for human habitation, for people at risk of homelessness, and people who are making below 30% of the area median income and live either in severe overcrowding, face eviction in the next 3 weeks, or have another risk factor for homelessness. Next slide, please. So when these funds come out, they're available for emergency shelter, for rapid rehousing. So there we can provide up to 24 months of rental assistance, financial assistance for move-in costs, and supportive services for people currently experiencing homelessness. Funds also can be used for post-disaster homelessness prevention. So that's up to 24 months of rental assistance, utility assistance, and supportive services for people at risk of homelessness, and outreach assistance, including assistance to meet urgent needs for people who are unsheltered. Next slide. So the statute did not tell us how to allocate the funds, so that was in the department's discretion. We determined that we should make 2 different allocations, one with best available data as soon as possible after FEMA makes that TSA designation. So we determined that this time coming out the gate, we would say for localities, we would do an initial allocation as the lesser of 1 million, or the number of sheltered or unsheltered homelessness based on the most recent point in time count, multiplied by fair market rent for a 1-bedroom apartment. And statewide allocations would be capped at $3 million. As it turned out in Florida, there were no localities that had to be capped. All the awards that we did by formula came in under 1 million, but we did cap the state of Florida at 3 million. So overall, it's 6.8 million to 7 local ESG grantees plus a grant to the state of Florida. We have a fact sheet on HUD's website, but in case you had not heard, the state gets 3 million. And then Collier County gets 861,000. Lee County gets 288,000. Orlando gets 666,000. Polk County gets 374,000. Seminole County gets 386,000. Tampa gets almost 800,000, and Volusia County gets $391,000 for a total of just under $6.8 million. Next slide, please. So we're going to do a second formula allocation later this year when we have more complete data on the extent of the damage. We're particularly interested in damage to rental units occupied by very low income households. We need that information to become available, which most likely is a minimum of 60 days after Hurricane Ian, and we're about a month out now. But that said, we're still developing the best methodology to use. And again, when we do put out a notice, you'll have an opportunity to advise us on whether we should approach this formula differently. Next slide. Oh, okay. Sorry, I think we're working off of different slide decks. So let me say, one of the policy decisions that I think you all would be particularly interested in While this program is built on the ESG chassis, we want to get the funds out as quickly as possible. So we made some changes. So definitely the best one, no match for the use of rush funds compared to the ESG program, which I believe is a 100% match. But then the second one, more controversial and was definitely a point of major discussion inside of HUD, was we waived the citizen participation plan requirement. So there is no opportunity for public comment on round one of the funds when they come out. And we did that because we said, look, the point is to get emergency shelter immediately, but then there will be some comment period with the second round of funds, but it's not likely to be the full 30 days. Again, because speed is of the essence. That's definitely something we're going to want to hear from folks about. So I think we're good with the deck. Joe, did you want to jump in?
I just wanted to put some of this funding in context, Marion, because we talk about 6.8, we've talked about the individual allocations, but in these first round, many grantees are getting at least a year's worth of relative to their annual ESG grant. In some of the jurisdictions, Collier County, for instance, is getting the equivalent of, I think, 3 or 4 years worth of funds relative to their annual ESG grants. So while in aggregate, 6.8 million might seem, oh my God, that's pretty low. It is many multiples of what we get to these jurisdictions in a regular year for the ESG program. And we believe that funding available right away is going to be able to kind of steer these grantees and the people experiencing homelessness in those jurisdictions into a much more stable and a much better outcome.
I see that there are some questions in the chat. Maybe
Yeah.
Sarah, can you moderate them for us?
Absolutely. I don't think you were on the line when I gave you and HUD a big shout out for this announcement. I just wanted to let you know we really appreciate HUD stepping in and showing such leadership and lifting up the needs of people who have the very lowest incomes and who are most at risk. So we really appreciate that. A couple of questions. One is whether or not people would have to go through coordinated entry in order to access these funds. And more generally, how do people apply for individuals? How would they apply for this assistance?
I'll go first, and Joe, you can follow behind me if you'd like. So we're following the ESG rules more broadly. So same system, same approaches, but with these funds being prioritizing people who were impacted by disasters and in the areas impacted by disasters. We're not trying to build a new program. Folks who are familiar with CDBG-DR know that it's kind of like CDBG, but mostly not. This is really a lot like ESG.
That's 100% want to double tap on what Marion just said. It's intended to use familiar structures, entities, and operators in the community who've been doing this work and know the folks who are most likely going to need the assistance rather than set up a brand new program.
Wonderful. Yeah. And I know that you're able to do this because of the FY20 spending bill that allowed you to use some ESG dollars for this purpose. For this coalition, it's very important that we continue to advocate for increased funding for this program moving forward so that you can continue to do this good work. Especially, we'd love to see it funded through FEMA's DERF program, through FEMA resources, since we know that those are much bigger in scope, wouldn't compete with appropriated programs, would be able to scale at the need that there is out there. I'm wondering what conversations HUD may be having about future funding for this program and what you guys are doing to track outcomes so that we can all collectively be making the case for why we need to continue this going forward.
So let me start on the funding piece. So one of the interesting the feature of the Section 231 authority is that there will be funds recaptured that would normally go back to Treasury, put into this fund every year. So we kind of have a self-funding mechanism. So whenever we do the grants closeout in the homeless program, whatever is left over at the end gets deposited into this fund, and at least 10% is reserved for the RUSH program. As you can see, we've had a number of years build up in this program, right? And then we started taking advantage of the authorities this year. So there's not always going to be $50 million available in this pot. That's been a couple years. But one of the things to know is that there will be funds deposited in the future and ongoing as long as we have recaptures in the homeless assistance grants program. We've just begun really having conversations with FEMA about how this fits into the larger disaster framework. Our friends at FEMA are pretty excited about it because they know that it serves a gap that their programs don't do or don't do well, depending on which population we're talking about. And we're going to keep working with them and having conversations to see how this funding fits against their funding, and to ensure that folks kind of don't get lost in any gaps as we put this new program into the mix.
And can you share, oh, sorry, sorry, Marianne.
Thanks, Sarah. I was just going to jump in on the metrics part of the question. So that's something we're thinking very much about. We don't know exactly what the right metrics should be, separate from the ESG program, specifically for disaster survivors. So that's something we're looking at and kicking around. I've mentioned several times we're going to go out for comment, but you need no invitation to tell the federal government what to do. So as always, we welcome everybody's thoughts about what would be the best way to approach metrics.
Definitely,
And then
we can talk to our research team and come back to you with some ideas. I think we're all very excited about this and want to be able to make a really strong case like we did for the Treasury ERA program, like for other programs, to show how it's impacting households.
And, we're really excited about it too. And we were hoping we would just be able to put a notice out there before we ever had to use it. But Ian kind of threw us off that path, and we said, well, let's put this one out there and enable us to learn from it and get some feedback on it. So we don't necessarily have a statutory objective in mind, knowing that we are always going to have some funds available, but not necessarily a ton of funds, was part of what led us to setting a pretty high threshold of only looking at disasters with TSA designations. But it does beg the question, if this is working, should this just be, like you said, part of FEMA?
Not part of FEMA. It would never
Funding part of
advocate for that.
FEMA have access to its own almost self-refilling pot.
Yes. So that leads me to another question. Maybe we don't have the answers to that just yet, which is, this coalition has really been pushing for disaster housing assistance program funds, DHAP, which would likewise provide rental assistance to households that have been displaced. There's a lot of similarities between DHAP and RUSH. Maybe one of the differences is around eligibility, where ESG is much more narrowly focused on people experiencing homelessness or very close to facing that risk of homelessness. And DHAP is a little bit broader to serve households with relatively higher incomes. Do you see this as replacing DHAP? How would it work together? Are they unrelated? Are they related? Just curious about how you're thinking about that.
Yeah, I'll go first, and then Marion can come behind me, mop up the mess that I'm about to leave, or probably not. So I think we need to start thinking about programs across the continuum of housing needs in disasters, and I think that that's useful because again, RUSH would only be triggered in a major disaster and TSA. Okay, I want to be clear because that's the framework we're working off right now. Obviously, you'll have opportunity to give comment on that, but right now that's what we're looking at. So this is a subset of majors, right? there's probably a subset that's a little before, a little less than that, but still pretty impactful where you would talk about DHAP or other programs like that. And again, that is available, or that would rely on FEMA's available funds in the DERF to fund that program, because that is a FEMA funded program with a direct admission assignment to HUD. While I don't want to say that they're like, look, they're two different programs entirely. I don't think us triggering rush in this disaster completely eliminates the need for a FEMA funded HUD direct admission assignment in the housing space, because there's going to be plenty of disasters where TSA is not triggered, but you might want to consider some sort of disaster housing program. And again, this is our program. We have absolute control over it, but with Dash, we're not as in the driver's seat. Or Dash, hold on, DHAP. Just messing my, too many acronyms. Anyway, with DHAP, it's it's different. It serves a different population. It has a different universe needed, and again, it's not HUD's program. Marion?
Good answer. Okay. And I think that is all that we have time for right now to go through questions. But again, I want to thank you so much for joining on. We really look forward to seeing this program be implemented. We plan to weigh in on the comment period when that's announced, and want to stay really close in touch with HUD to make sure that this program, and with our partners on the ground, to make sure that this is as successful as possible going forward. So thank you again for joining with us. Really appreciate it. And now we'll turn to our final, thank you. Now we'll turn to our final speaker, Noah, who's going to share a little bit about the CDBG-DR authorization bill and work to get that across the finish line.
Hello, everybody. Noah Patton, NLIHC Housing Policy Analyst for Disaster Recovery. And speaking of acronyms and crazy acronyms, going to talk a little bit about CDBG-DR, or the Community Development Block Grant Disaster Recovery Program, and specifically legislation that we've been working on. One of the DHRC's biggest priorities, legislation to permanently authorize that program. And we'll kind of talk a little bit about prospects in the coming year and what you can do to assist in those efforts. So I'll take the next slide. So just as a brief reminder, I'm not going to go through all of this. That's mostly a reminder to myself, but this is the process that Community Development Block Grant Disaster Recovery Funds go through from the point of the disaster to states being able to access funds. And CDBG-DR, of course, is the only source for federal long-term recovery funds available, typically after a disaster. And of course, because the program is not permanently authorized, Congress needs to approve pots of money via the program at each time after every disaster, which it doesn't necessarily always do for each disaster, but often occurs. And so these funds are very flexible. They can be spent on housing, infrastructure, business development or redevelopment, which is great because every disaster is different. And so needs after every disaster are different. But of course, it can present some challenges when the goal of these programs are to ensure that these funds are going to those folks that are most in need of it. And, specifically that's talking about housing assistance, whether that's rental assistance, homeowner assistance, or, the construction of additional housing and that sort of thing. So I'll take the next slide here. So as you can see, that was a very complicated process to receive, for a state to receive those funds. That lengthy process slows down recovery time. And primarily the process is that lengthy because it's not permanently authorized. So HUD has to rewrite regulations each time funds are approved. Because these regulations are rewritten each time, a state can't necessarily pre-plan what it's going to be using these funds for. The requirements may vary. It creates situations where funds could be spent disproportionately or away from folks that need it most. There's a lack of oversight of grantees just based on manpower and capacity from HUD, and then of course capacity issues for smaller grantees, because typically these funds are going to at times will go to municipalities and count for, like, many times their general operating budget for the year. So it's a lot of work and a lot of technical assistance needed to ensure that these funds are actually reaching the ground and programs are actually functioning. So lucky for us, we do have a potential solution here. I'll take the next slide. And that solution is passing the Reforming Disaster Recovery Act 2021. So that's Senate Bill 2471. It's primarily sponsored by Brian Schatz, Collins, Young, Leahy, Cassidy, Wyden, and then the House version was introduced by Representative Al Green from Texas there. So it's a bipartisan bill. It permanently authorizes the CDBG-DR program. So that would immediately ensure that funds are more quickly reaching those most in need of assistance following a disaster. And it also does a lot of fiddly bits that we really like at NLIHC and the DHRC. It requires equitable distribution of resources between housing, infrastructure, and economic development, where there, among housing funds, requiring that there's a proportional amount of funds going to homeowners as well as renters. Sometimes we see an overemphasis on home ownership as opposed to renters based on who's impacted. It prioritizes data transparency and oversight, so allowing kind of access to the data that is being collected via the CDBG-DR program that allows our lovely friends in research to do their thing with that and analyze how well the programs are working. Reinforces civil rights and fair housing protections, and there's a number of mitigation and resiliency aspects too. So this is the bill that we're looking to get done by the end of the year. As you can tell, it's never been more pressing. It's always pressing because there's always disasters, but of course I think these past two storms, as well as how heavy hit the Midwest and Kentucky have been, I think underscore the need to get this done. So I'll take the next slide. So this is what we're looking at for the end of the year here. So there is a version in the House version of the National Defense Authorization Act, or the NDAA. So the Senate and the House will be conferencing together to crank out a kind of final version of that bill. That's the bill that authorizes defense spending. So typically that's a pretty high priority for Congress. So we're hopeful that the House version can stay in the NDAA throughout those negotiations. There's also a version in the Senate Transportation, Housing, and Urban Development Appropriations Bill for the end of the year fiscal year 2023 budget package that we're also hoping to keep alive in there. So previously the version had passed the House in 2019. It does have administrative support, very powerfully by HUD, as well as the Government Accountability Office, and it's had that through the past two administrations. So on a bipartisan basis, and an excellent survey by the Bipartisan Policy Center found that 97% of the people that actually work the CDBG-DR program support permanent authorization of programs. So as we move into the end of the year, the goal is to get this sucker attached to any sort of moving vehicle or must-pass package. Of course, the NDAA and the appropriations bill is and the fiscal year 2023 budget. Of course, the main objectives here, and we'd love your help by signing on to a sign-on letter that we just today are putting out there. just to let folks in Congress know the massive scale of support that this bill has. So thank you so much.
Thank you, Noah. And with that, we're going to conclude today's call. I appreciate everybody joining on. As a reminder, we will not have the call next week. That is Election Day. Again, your nonpartisan reminder to go out and vote. And we will return to having our calls the following week. So we will see you all then. Thank you very much for joining.